Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When I bought this house, I thought I had found the perfect place, peace, nature, and complete control over my land. But my new neighbors from the HOA had other plans. They wanted my pond. They wanted to break me, but if they thought I would surrender without a fight, they made the biggest mistake of their lives. I never thought I'd have to fight for something that was legally mine. When I bought this property, I imagined a peaceful life away from the constant noise and restrictions of suburban neighborhoods. No more overbearing HOA rules, no nosy neighbors dictating what color my mailbox should be, no arbitrary fines for leaving my trash bin out a minute too long. Just me, my wife, and the quiet serenity of our private pond, surrounded by lush trees and rolling hills. It was everything I had worked for, my own slice of paradise. The house was a beautiful, rustic, two-story structure with large windows that overlooked the water. The pond itself was mine, legally documented as part of the property. I had triple-checked the records before buying. No shared ownership, no right-of-way access, no disputes, just private land that belonged solely to me. It was perfect, a place where I could finally breathe, away from the suffocating grip of suburban developments. But peace never lasts long when you have entitled people living nearby. The first sign of trouble came a few weeks after we settled in. One afternoon, I noticed a group of people standing near the pond's edge. At first, I assumed they had just wandered over by mistake, unaware that the property had changed owners. I stepped outside, ready to politely let them know that they were trespassing. But before I could even say a word, a middle-aged man in a tailored polo and khaki shorts turned to me with an air of entitlement. "Ah, you must be the new owner," he said with a confident smile. "I'm Richard Collins, president of the HOA. Welcome to the community." I shook his hand, though something about his tone put me on edge. "Nice to meet you," I replied. "Just to clarify, my property isn't part of the HOA." Collins let out a small chuckle, as if I had said something amusing. "Oh, I know, but we've been using this pond for years. The previous owners never minded. We even stock it with fish and host summer gatherings here. It's sort of a community landmark." I frowned. "That's going to have to change. This is private property, and I'd appreciate it if people respected that." His smile tightened. "I understand your perspective, but let's be reasonable. You don't want to be on bad terms with your neighbors, do you? It would be a shame to create unnecessary tension." There it was, the thinly veiled threat. I knew his type, the kind of man who was used to getting his way through polite intimidation. I wasn't about to roll over. "My decision is final. I don't want anyone on my property without permission." Collins exhaled through his nose and glanced at the other HOA members, as if deciding whether I was worth the effort. "Well," he said, after a long pause, "I hope you reconsider. After all, we're a community here. It's always best when neighbors work together." I watched as they slowly left, their conversation hushed as they walked back toward the rows of identical homes in their neatly planned development. The moment they were out of sight, I turned back toward my house, my hands clenched into fists. Something told me this wasn't over. 2 days later, just as I was beginning to enjoy the quiet again, I saw Richard Collins walking up my driveway. This time, he wasn't alone. He had brought along 2 other HOA board members, one woman in a stiff blazer and an older man in sunglasses who carried himself like a retired military officer. Their presence immediately set off alarms in my head. This wasn't a social visit. I stepped out onto my porch, arms crossed as they approached. Collins smiled like a man who was convinced he was about to close a deal. "Tom," he greeted me, his voice smooth as silk. "Glad we caught you at home. We wanted to have a civil discussion about the pond situation." "There's nothing to discuss," I said firmly. "It's my property. End of story." The woman in the blazer, Diane if I remembered correctly, let out a short, forced laugh. "Now, let's not be hasty. The pond has been used by the community for years. It's a natural gathering spot for our neighborhood, and we'd hate to see that change." "That's not my problem," I replied. "It was never public property, and I'm not obligated to give anyone access to it." The older man, who had been silent up until now, adjusted his sunglasses and cleared his throat. "I understand where you're coming from, son, but it's not that simple. When the previous owners lived here, they allowed community access. That sets a precedent." I narrowed my eyes. "A precedent?" That was complete nonsense. This wasn't some legal gray area, it was private land. But Collins, ever the politician, smoothly took over the conversation. "Tom," he said, his tone shifting to something almost sympathetic, "you're new here. You probably don't realize how much this pond means to everyone. We have summer gatherings, fishing tournaments, even 4th of July fireworks right here. People have made memories at this pond. It's part of our identity as a community." I let out a dry chuckle. "So what? Because you guys have memories here, I'm supposed to just give up my rights?" Colin's smile didn't falter, but I could see his fingers twitch slightly, as if he didn't like being challenged. "We're trying to be reasonable," he said. "We can draft an agreement that benefits both sides. We'll even take care of maintenance. You won't have to lift a finger." My patience was wearing thin. "And what if I say no?" There was a beat of silence. Diane's expression hardened slightly. The older man's jaw tensed. Collins, however, just sighed dramatically, as if I were some stubborn child refusing to share my toys. "Well," he said, choosing his words carefully, "we'd really hate for things to get complicated." I didn't miss the implied threat. My instincts told me that this wasn't just about some neighborhood tradition. This was about control. The HOA had been using my property like their personal resort for years, and now they were scrambling to keep it that way. I took a step forward, looking Collins dead in the eye. "I don't respond well to intimidation," I said, "and if any of you step foot on my land without my permission, you'll be trespassing." Collins' polite facade cracked for just a fraction of a second. His lips pressed into a thin line, his jaw tightening. But then, just as quickly, the politician was back, offering me an easygoing chuckle. All right, he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "No need to get defensive. We'll leave you to think about it." "I don't need to think about it," I said. "The answer is no." They turned and walked back toward the street, murmuring to each other in low voices. Collins didn't look back at me, but I knew this wasn't the last I'd see of him. As soon as they were gone, I double-checked the locks on my gates and made sure my security cameras were working. I had a feeling I was going to need them. That evening, I finally felt like I could relax. Collins and his little HOA entourage had left, and I had made my position crystal clear. I sat on my back porch sipping a beer, enjoying the quiet. The air was cool, the sky was a soft orange as the sun dipped below the trees, and for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had gotten the message. Then I heard it. Laughter, voices, the unmistakable splash of someone jumping into the water. My grip on the bottle tightened. No way. I stood up and walked toward the pond. As I cleared the tree line, my stomach dropped. There were at least 20 people on my property. Families had set up blankets, lawn chairs, and coolers right on my land. Kids were screaming as they cannonballed into the pond, sending waves crashing against the shore. A group of adults stood around a grill, drinking beers as smoke curled up into the evening sky. One man was even setting up a goddamn tent at the edge of the property, as if he planned to camp out for the night. For a second, I was too stunned to react. They had actually done it. They had stormed onto my land like it was a public park, completely ignoring everything I had told Collins earlier that day. The shock wore off quickly, replaced by a seething rage. I stormed toward the group, raising my voice over the noise. "Everyone off my property! Now!" The reaction was a mix of startled looks and dismissive shrugs. A man flipping burgers at the grill gave me an amused glance. "Hey buddy, relax," he said. "We're just having a little get-together. No harm done." "No harm done," I repeated, barely believing what I was hearing. I pointed toward the pond. "You're trampling my property, polluting my water, and treating my land like it's a goddamn public beach. I don't care what Collins told you. This is private property." Some people started packing up, clearly not wanting to deal with confrontation. Others, however, weren't so eager to leave. "We've been coming here for years," a woman scoffed. "You can't just close it off." I took a slow breath, trying to keep my temper in check. "Yes, I can." And I just did. "So I suggest you start walking before I call the police for trespassing." A murmur spread through the crowd. Some were still defiant, but a few key words, police, trespassing, private property, finally seemed to sink in. One by one, they began gathering their things, some grumbling, others throwing me dirty looks as they left. But not Collins. He stood near the water, arms crossed, watching me with an infuriating smirk. "See, Tom," he said as the last of the stragglers disappeared into the trees. "People love this pond. You really want to be the guy who ruins that?" I stepped closer, locking eyes with him. "If I see one more person trespassing here, I'll make sure the next gathering happens at a police station. Got it?" His smirk didn't waver, but I saw something flicker in his eyes. Annoyance, maybe even anger. Without another word, he turned and walked away. I stood there, fists clenched, as the last of them finally disappeared into the night. They thought they could wear me down, that if they just ignored my boundaries, I'd give up and let them have their way. They were dead wrong. Tomorrow, I was building a damn fence. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them. Collins, his smug grin, those entitled neighbors treating my land like their personal playground. Every word they said echoed in my head. You can't just close it off. People love this pond. It's part of the community. Number not anymore. By the time the sun rose, I had a plan. If words weren't enough, I'd make damn sure they had a physical reminder of where my land ended and their privileges stopped. At 7 a.m. sharp, I was on the phone with a fencing company. I didn't care what it cost. I didn't care how soon they were booked. I needed a perimeter built immediately. And when I explained that I was dealing with constant trespassers, the guy on the other end understood my urgency. "Got a crew finishing a job early," he said. "We can be there by noon. You sure you want this done all at once? It'll be extra for the rush job." "I don't care what it costs," I said. "Just get it done today." By midday, 5 trucks rumbled up my driveway. A team of workers hopped out hauling heavy wooden posts, industrial-grade chain-link panels, and rolls of razor wire. They moved fast. By 5 p.m., a full 6-foot-tall fence surrounded my entire property. Not some flimsy picket fence, but a serious barrier, reinforced posts, locked gates, and security cameras mounted at key points. If anyone even thought about coming near my land again, I'd have them on video before they could blink. I stood at the entrance, admiring the work, when one of the crew members walked up. He wiped sweat from his forehead and nodded toward the pond. "You weren't kidding about people using this place," he said. "Couple of them tried sneaking in while we were setting up." That didn't surprise me. They had gotten away with it for so long, they thought they were untouchable. But that was over. By 6 p.m., the job was done. The last panel was bolted into place. The final lock secured. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction as I inspected the fence, running my hand along the cold metal. "Try crossing this, Collins. I dare you." I barely had time to enjoy my victory before the shouting started. It was around 7 p.m. when I heard furious banging on my front gate. I didn't need to guess who it was. I took my time walking over, savoring every second of their frustration. When I reached the entrance, I saw exactly what I expected. Collins, Diane, and about half a dozen furious neighbors standing outside, faces red with rage. Collins was practically vibrating with anger. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, gesturing at the fence. I leaned against the gate casually. "A barrier to keep trespassers out." Diane scoffed. "You're being ridiculous. This is a safety hazard. What if someone gets hurt?" "Then maybe they shouldn't be breaking the law," I said coolly. Collins stepped closer, gripping the bars of the gate like he wanted to rip them off. "This isn't over, Braun. You're going to regret this." I smiled. I highly doubt that. His jaw clenched. He turned on his heel and stormed off, neighbors trailing behind him like angry sheep. I watched them go, feeling nothing but satisfaction. For the first time since moving in, I finally felt like this land was mine. Of course, I should have known that Collins wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly, and he was about to make his biggest mistake yet. It had been 2 days since I built the fence, and I was finally starting to feel at ease. No more uninvited guests, no more cannonball splashes in my pond, no more entitled neighbors treating my land like a public park. Every time I checked the security cameras, the sight of that sturdy locked gate made me feel like I had finally won. But deep down, I knew Collins wasn't the type to give up. He wasn't done with me yet. It happened on the 3rd evening. A knock at the door, slow, deliberate. When I opened it, I was met with a sight that made my blood boil. Richard Collins stood there, flanked by 2 men I had never seen before. Both of them were big, the kind of guys you'd expect to see bouncing drunks out of a club or working as hired muscle for someone who couldn't handle their own problems. They were dressed casually, but there was nothing casual about the way they stood. Shoulders squared, arms crossed, silent as statues. Collins, on the other hand, had his usual smug grin, but this time it felt colder. "Tom," he greeted smoothly, like this was just a friendly, neighborly visit. "Mind if we come in?" I didn't move, didn't step aside, didn't blink. "You can say whatever you need to right here." Collins sighed, shaking his head like I was being difficult. "Look, this whole situation has gotten out of hand. We both know that. The fence, the threats of calling the cops, it's unnecessary. We just want to talk, man to man." I wasn't stupid. This wasn't a conversation. This was a show of force. He wanted me scared. He wanted me to see these two bruisers and think twice about saying no. But what he didn't know was that as soon as I had opened the door, my hand had already slipped into my pocket and hit record on my phone. "All right," I said, playing along. "Talk." Collins stepped a little closer, lowering his voice just enough to make it feel more threatening. "This doesn't have to be a problem, Tom," he said, voice dripping with false patience. "People love that pond. They've been using it for years. You can't just come in here and take it away. It's not right. It's not fair." I cocked my head. "You mean it's not fair that you don't get to do whatever the hell you want with my land?" One of the big guys let out a low chuckle. Collins didn't even acknowledge it. He just smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Think about this carefully," he continued. "Do you really want to be the outsider here? The guy who pissed off the entire community? Do you know how bad things can get when you don't get along with your neighbors?" He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Fences can be damaged, cameras can malfunction, things can happen." It took everything in me not to react, not to punch this smug bastard in the face right then and there. Instead, I smiled, a slow knowing smile. "You know what, Collins?" I said. "I think we're done here." His grin flickered. "Excuse me." I took one step forward, closing the distance between us. His muscle-bound friend stiffened slightly, clearly not expecting that. "I said," I repeated, voice calm, steady, "we're done. Get off my porch." For the first time since I met him, I saw Collins hesitate. "Think about what I said, Tom," he warned, taking a slow step back. "You don't want to make this harder on yourself." "Go," I said simply. He exhaled through his nose. But he left, his two shadows following close behind him. I watched them go, waiting until they disappeared down the street before finally pulling my phone out of my pocket. I hit stop on the recording, then I pressed save. If Collins thought I was scared, he was about to find out just how wrong he was. The next evening, I returned home late after running errands in town. As I pulled up to my driveway, something immediately felt off. My headlights swept across my front yard, and a sinking feeling settled in my gut before I even saw it. The fence was gone. Not just damaged, completely destroyed. Metal posts lay twisted and mangled, yanked out of the ground like they were nothing. The chain-link panels were torn apart, some pieces tossed carelessly into the pond, others crumpled near the trees. The security cameras were missing, their mounts ripped clean off the house. The locked gate? Nowhere in sight. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. Then I saw them. The neighbors were back. At least a dozen people were gathered right at the water's edge, acting as if nothing had happened. Kids splashed in the pond. A few men stood around a new grill, beer bottles in hand, laughing. A couple had even brought inflatable pool floats, as if this was some kind of goddamn resort. And, standing off to the side, arms crossed, a very satisfied-looking Richard Collins watched me pull in. I got out of the truck slowly, my body tense with rage. "What the hell is this?" I said, my voice dangerously low. Collins spread his hands in mock innocence. "Tom, buddy, what happened to your fence? Looks like someone must have had a real problem with it." My fists clenched at my sides. "This is trespassing, and you damn well know it." One of the men near the grill, the same guy who had argued with me last time, snorted. "Relax, man. We just wanted to enjoy the pond, like always. No harm done." I took a slow breath. Every muscle in my body screamed for me to lash out, to start tearing into these people the way they had torn apart my property. But I had something better. Without another word, I pulled out my phone. Collins finally lost his smug expression. "You're making a mistake," he said, stepping toward me. "There's no need to escalate this." "Oh, I agree," I said. That's why I'm letting the police handle it." I hit dial. And just like that, the party was over. The courtroom was packed. HOA board members sat stiffly on one side, their usual smug confidence replaced with nervous tension. A few of the neighbors who had gleefully trampled my land were present too, whispering among themselves, casting uneasy glances my way. But the real show was at the defendant's table. Richard Collins, his face pale, hands clasped together, looking far less cocky than usual. I had made sure of that. My lawyer, a no-nonsense bulldog of a woman named Sarah Green, had spent the last 2 weeks compiling every piece of evidence we had. The property deed, proving the pond was 100% mine. Security camera footage of trespassers before the cameras were destroyed. The audio recording of Collins threatening me with accidents and malfunctions. The police report detailing the destruction of my fence and illegal trespassing. And then came the final nail in the coffin, the forged documents. Collins had submitted false paperwork to the local zoning office, trying to claim my pond was a public recreational area. He had altered property records, hoping to create legal confusion over land rights. He thought no one would catch it, but Sarah had caught it. And now the judge had it in black and white. Judge Carter, an older man with sharp eyes and no patience for nonsense, sighed deeply as he set the papers down. Then he turned his gaze to Collins. "Mr. Collins," he said, voice laced with disgust, "not only did you and your association repeatedly trespass on private property, but you attempted to falsify legal documents to justify your actions. This is beyond a simple civil dispute. This is fraud." A hush fell over the room. Collins opened his mouth to argue, but the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, the threats made against the plaintiff, recorded and submitted into evidence, demonstrate clear intent to intimidate and coerce. Mr. Braun exercised remarkable restraint in handling this matter legally instead of responding in kind. I smirked. Damn right I had. The gavel slammed down. The ruling was brutal. Collins was arrested on the spot for fraud, intimidation, and property destruction. The HOA was fined heavily, forced to compensate me for damages, legal fees, and emotional distress. My property rights were reaffirmed, and anyone from the HOA caught stepping onto my land would face immediate legal consequences. As the bailiff pulled Collins up from his seat, he finally looked at me. No smugness, no arrogance, just fear. "You can't do this," he hissed. "You think you've won?" I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice. "I don't think," I said. "I know." And as they hauled him away, I knew I'd never have to deal with this HOA again. I stood at the edge of my pond, hands in my pockets, watching the water ripple under the early morning light. For the first time since moving here, it was quiet, peaceful, mine. No more trespassers, no more entitled neighbors treating my land like a public park. No more Richard Collins and his smug threats. Just me, my wife, and the land I had fought for. The fallout from the trial had been swift. With Collins behind bars, the HOA had collapsed under the weight of legal fees, fines, and public humiliation. Turns out, mine wasn't the only case of overreach. Once the fraud came to light, other residents started speaking up about ridiculous fines, shady accounting, and intimidation tactics Collins had used for years. A few weeks later, I got a knock on my door. This time, it wasn't a threat. It was a former HOA member, an older man who had kept quiet throughout the ordeal. He looked nervous, shuffling his feet before speaking. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," he muttered. "We let Collins run things for too long. We should have stopped him sooner." I let the silence hang between us for a moment before nodding. "Just don't let it happen again." He gave a grateful smile and left. Maybe not all my neighbors were lost causes. Now standing here, watching the sun rise over my pond, I felt it. Relief. I had fought, I had won, and most importantly, I had never backed down. Because when you own something, when it's yours, you don't let anyone take it from you. Not now. Not ever.